Welcome to this introductory talk on organisational change. An initial introduction to the topic and some of the aspects that we're going to explore. Always important to start with what do we mean by organisational change. And if we think about the organisations we work in, the organisations we've experienced, they are constantly changing. As time goes on, an organisation is constantly changing. So if we look at an organisation, it's constantly undergoing change. If we look back 2 years, for instance, 2 years ago, and we compare the organisation with what it looks like today, there'll be a number of differences, could be quite radically different. And that change is naturally occurring, it's ongoing, and it will carry on going as well. And of course, when we think about what we've experienced over the past year and a half, actually some major external events have happened to considerably change how our organisations operate and their nature. So the pandemic has radically influenced that change as well. In this module though, we're looking at something slightly different than this natural change. In some ways we're looking at something I'm going to talk about and describe as organised change, where we're trying to deliberately intervene. We're trying to deliberately bring about change. We're not prepared to wait for it to happen just over time. There's an urgency perhaps for us to make some interventions to bring about change. So I'm going to talk about this organised change. And when we talk about organised change, in some ways what we're trying to do is we're looking at the current state of the organisation, the current state. That's where the organisation is now. And in an organised change, we're trying to bring about a future state, might call it a future desired state. And what we're trying to do in this organised change is take the organisation where it is now to a different place in the future. Usually what we're trying to do, it's usually trying to improve or make the organisation better in some way. That's usually what, I don't think, there's very few examples where people deliberately set out to make the organisation worse. We're talking in situations, this organised change, where we're trying to bring about a future desired state. And that can be various reasons. If we think about the different reasons why we might want to intervene or bring about change, it could be about solving problems. So we've got a position here where we're trying to solve a particular problem. So in an organisational setting, that might be something like very high sickness levels. All organisations are trying to tackle some common issues such as the gender pay gap. So it might be that we recognise in the current state there's some problems that we need to address and we need to deal with to move the organisation on. It might be something like improving customer satisfaction. We might recognise that we're getting a lot of complaints, lots of poor feedback, and we want to actually change that to get much better feedback, to get much happier customers. So a future desired state might be happier, satisfied customers, for instance. And we've recognised we want to achieve that and want to move the organisation to get that. It might be often about cost and efficiency, so we've got some inefficiencies here, and we've recognised that we want to make the organisation more efficient, for instance. It could be other measures of performance that we want to improve, or it could be generally more cultural things in the organisation. It might be that we've got poor motivation, for instance. Or a lack of innovation. And we've got these issues and we want to improve. So we want to move to an organisation that's more creative, more innovative, perhaps more competitive, all of those things. And those are usually, this future desired state is often articulated in the form of some form of goals, objectives, and often in the form of strategy. So we might have a 5-year strategy to increase skills across the organisation. So we often articulate this future state in terms of strategy and goals. And I've been using the term organisation, but in some ways this idea of organised change can happen at lots of different levels. It can happen at the personal level. Many organisations set goals, and we might have our own career goals as professionals, managers, whatever job we do. And in some ways, we're not prepared to sit back and just perhaps hope that will happen. We engage in some sort of organised change at a personal level as well. That might be also at a team level, organisation level, and when we think about the current challenges and crises in society, we're trying to do this at a global level as well, to tackle the major crises we have currently facing: a health crisis in the pandemic, we've been facing economic crisis, a grand recession, or great recession for the last 10 years at least, and of course the climate crisis is a looming global threat. And what we're trying to do as a planet, as human society, is the planet will change. What we're trying to do is organise some of that change to bring about a better state. So to bring about a future desired state, a zero carbon state, a sustainable society. So this idea of organised change operates at all of these levels. The problem that we have is, and we know this from a personal level, we might set some very bold and ambitious targets for change. There might be very worthy targets for change. The problem we have is it's very hard to achieve that. And we know from personal level we set goals, and we very rarely, from my personal experience, meet all those goals every time. We move forward in some way and we do achieve things, but it's never necessarily in this easy, straightforward state. And in terms of why is change a problem, some of the evidence is that about 70% of change initiatives, change interventions fail. That's quite a high failure rate, and that seems to match with our experience that we have lots of strategies in organisations, many of them in the end sit on a shelf collecting dust, and often we feel as if things aren't actually improving and nothing really changes. So in some ways this highlights what we're trying to do in the organisation, in this exploration of change. In a way, the line I've drawn there is almost the intended change. That's what we intend to do. In actual practice, what happens is what do we actually achieve? What do we realise? What is the realised state? So often we might make some improvement, but we don't reach this level. We actually reach this level here. So we do achieve some change. Sometimes we might not achieve any, or it might get worse. But typically we do achieve some sort of progress. But what we see there is this gap. So there's a gap here between what we tried to achieve, what we intended to achieve, and this is the realised or the actual. We set out trying to achieve that, we actually achieve that. and we end up with a gap. So in some ways what we're really trying to do in this exploration of change, in this as we explore it across this module, is trying to understand more about this gap and understand why it's so difficult and why we often fall short. The evidence is it might be at least 70% of the time. And that's important. And it's important because even on a human level, with ourselves as managers trying to bring about this change, it's a lot of wasted effort. So if it doesn't realise its intended aims, we've wasted a lot of time and effort, lots of activity, lots of programmes, lots of people involved in project teams, working groups. We might have invested in lots of technology and new technology to support that. So a lot of time and effort goes into trying to meet that. So almost this gap is a waste as well. It's almost indicating there's a waste. And if we're really trying to solve important problems, actually the harms and negative consequences that we're trying to address simply aren't addressed. So if it's something about equality in the workplace, if we're just failing to achieve this future state and we've got a gap, the current harms will continue to exist. Lack of diversity, lack of opportunity, lack of efficiency, all of those things. So the failure is important. It has some real world consequences. So what's the purpose of this organisational change module that we're going to be exploring these issues more over the next sessions? Well, the purpose of the module really is to try and understand this gap. And if we think about change, why is it important to explore it? If we think about the jobs that managers and professionals do, I'll say leaders as well. I'm picking managers at any levels, but especially managers at senior levels and leaders of organisations. The job is essentially about change. The job of managers, leaders and professionals is often about bringing about change, bringing about improvement, delivering strategy, bringing about future desired states, solving organisational problems. In a way, the definition of a professional is an ability to look at complex and novel situations and solve problems. So it's part of the job. So in some ways, to develop an understanding of change is quite key if we're going to be successful as managers, professionals and leaders. And really what we're developing in this module is trying to develop some explanations for this gap. If we can understand this better, if we can understand why we often fall short, why it's so difficult to achieve, then that will help us understand more about change and enable us to be more effective in our jobs and make the organisation a better place, help it run better, or even help society transform to something more fair, more equal. So it's worthwhile. It's worthwhile for us to do it. And change actually is complex on a psychological level as well. So the failure of delivering change has its psychological impacts as well. It actually impacts on us, on our well-being. It's demoralising when we try to bring about change and it fails. So the more we can do to understand this and perhaps try and close that gap in the way we do change is going to be useful for us at a number of different levels. There's a couple of ways we're going to explore this topic, and we're going to almost highlight some assumptions about the way we're going to approach the topic. Just a few key assumptions. Assumptions about the way we're going to explore this. The first assumption is that change is complex. This is absolutely key to everything. We're not trying to simplify this problem. In some ways we're trying to complexify it, to say we're not going to be able to deal with this unless we really embrace, recognise and surface the complexity. And that's inherent in the approach to this module overall. The other bit is this idea of context. When we're thinking about how we bring about change and how we understand why it sometimes works and why it sometimes doesn't, actually it's important to understand the context. So bringing about change in a university can be quite different than even in a different educational setting like a primary school. So the context is important. Some initiative or intervention that works well to improve learning in a university won't work in the same context, in a different context like a primary school or even a secondary school. So context is important. It would be different if we're thinking about the National Health Service, the military, the finance sector, government. The context makes a difference. And that's something we'll explore all the way through. This isn't about change in a very general sense. It matters where the change is occurring and the individual circumstances and situation. This is almost a disclaimer at the start of this study, really. I'm not going to offer any silver bullets. I'm not going to offer a panacea or a single solution that's going to solve this problem of organisational change. It's quite compelling. There's lots of books written about change, lots of popular books that tries to offer a winning solution that will solve all of our problems. Those books will continue to be written, but really the reality is there aren't any one-size universal solutions to solve this. We need to understand the complexity of it and do something that works for our own problem and our own context. And linked to the complexity, it's got lots of different facets. And we're going to take an interdisciplinary approach. So we're going to look at aspects like psychology, organisational theory, sociology, how people interact, as well as what they think from a psychological perspective, and even bits of anthropology and evolutionary biology in terms of how human beings have evolved and how those evolutionary traits and behaviours impact on the way we bring about change, the way we respond to change. So a very interdisciplinary approach, a multi-layered approach. And in some ways this explanation, another word for that is to theorise. And build up theories and explanations of change. And there's lots of ways we can explore this. Again, there's a number of different approaches we can look at that. And there's a number of different reasons, if you like, for this gap occurring. And it's not likely to be just one simple thing. It could be that the problem that we're trying to deal with is so complex that it's unrealistic for us to ever achieve this future desired state. We can perhaps improve it, but the problem is difficult. It's very difficult to solve. There might be some limitations. The problem might lie in our approach, the programme, or the mechanism by which we approach change. So the route that we take might be the root cause of the problem. As we progress from A to B, if you like, we're making lots of individual decisions along the way. And those individual decisions and choices combined together can also help explain why this gap occurs. It also could be that the goals we've set are unsuitable, unrealistic, unwise, perhaps even unethical. So even thinking about, is this the right thing to do, is important. And some of the problems might be that it's an unachievable gap. As individuals, we often set unachievable targets and know how demoralising those can be. I've over the years set several targets about trying to improve the speed that I can run when I go out jogging. I've very rarely achieved this future desired state. So often it's an issue with the goals themselves. And the other bit is the broader context. Organisations aren't laboratory conditions. They exist within society. They're populated by human beings who live most of their lives in broader society. So there's a societal impact as well, a broader context. So there's lots of different reasons that we'll develop to theorise this gap. And as part of the way that the module's structured, it's really building on this idea of complexity. And we'll move through 4 different phases or domains, really. One is to look at the complexity of change itself. We'll then look at the complexity of human nature and the impact that our complex nature of human beings, we don't always act in a rational, logical way. The complex nature of organisations. Human beings are complex individually. Once we start operating in groups and as broader organisations in a collective way, it becomes even more complex. And the complex nature of society itself. All of these levels of complexity is something we're going to study to help us theorise this problem of change. And I hope that gives you a useful introduction to what we're going to explore. And the essence of it is helping us explain and theorise this gap that occurs whenever, or most of the time, when we try to organise change. Thank you.